This is the Renaissance, and as you know, this is a 200-year period because it is from 1400 to the 1600. And women in the religion, if you were attending my medieval lectures, you will see that all of them were Catholic. And this is the beginning of the Protestant religion. But I am going to be focusing more on the nun aspects in the Catholic Church. And then I am going to see what happens. We're going to analyze what happened to the nuns when the Protestant Reformation began, and they began closing a lot of the monasteries, the convents, leaving many nuns nowhere to go. As I said last week, that it was common for girls in noble families to be dropped off at the convent. And they brought with them dowries, but they were much smaller dowries than a marriage alliance would be. But it was still a dowry, and it was used to keep up the convents, for instance, to keep them running, like many gardens. They liked to plant gardens, charities. They kept up with the charities and food. And they usually enter the convent in autumn. The reason why they enter the convent in autumn is because a lot of the wealthy families and even poor families, that was when they get their paycheck. So the paycheck kept rolling in and they got money. So it was like their paycheck. And the reason why they got their money is because of harvest. They settled the harvest settlements on the estate, and they applied the settlements, the earnings that they made for harvest, into their dowry. In the early Renaissance, the girls could enter around 10 or 12. However, in the later Renaissance, after the Council of Trent, there was a treaty where girls could enter it. They could not enter it until they were 12 years old. So this allowed the girls to spend more time with their families instead. And girls, they usually profess their vows around 14 or 15. Now remember that they entered the convent around 10 or 12, so this allowed them time to be trained into how to be a nun and getting to know the Catholic religion. And the young girls who enter the convent was either by choice or they were forced into it because the dowry was cheaper in the convent compared to finding a husband. And this is a picture right here of a female nun. And the artist who did this, Sofa Nabisa, she is a female Renaissance artist that you will later learn in week 5 of the Renaissance, in my Renaissance lecture. She is a very famous female artist. So what were the advantages of being a nun? Well, for one, women did not have to enter into an arranged alliance. For if a girl was forced to marry an older man, they didn't have to do that when they're a nun. And women received a basic education. Most of young women were taught to write, read, and learn Latin. And most nuns, they were healthier and they generally lived longer than most women outside of the convent, so they didn't have to face the diseases. And another advantage to being a nun was there was a close sisterhood. They developed friendships as nuns, and even when most nunneries were dissolved and some nuns were forced to leave the convent, the former nuns, they kept in close correspondence with each other, so they developed lifelong lasting friendships with each other. So what was the daily routine of being a nun? The nuns lived a restricted life that was closed off from the outside world. The convents, they had high walls, so no one could escape out of the wall. It was high. They couldn't look out into the outside world. And even during churches, they were hidden behind a screen, so none of the congregation could see the nuns. So they were hidden from public sight, and it was very confiscated life. And the nuns, their daily schedule, they consisted of work, prayer, meditation, reading, and choir. And choir was an attractive appeal for nuns because it was a luxury that only wealthy women in the noble class could do, because they couldn't afford music lessons and they could be in a choir. They recited their first prayer, matins, so they had to wake up at 2 a.m. for their prayers, and laws, which was at daybreak, so they would say laws afterwards. And their ending prayer was complain. And the nuns, they retired to bed at 8, so they woke up at 2 and went to bed at 8 at night. And their work consisted on garden plots. They liked to copy manuscripts and produce psalters for their daily convent use. And nuns, they had a lot of time for leisure. And they took this time doing a lot of philosophical and scientific works. They liked to write in journals or devotionals, and they made many scientific treatises and theological theories. And they also liked to read plays or poetry. Okay, former nuns in the Reformation. This is when the Protestant Reformation began. Martin Luther's teachings inspired many nuns to escape convents. One of them, which we will find out, will be his wife. These nuns married and followed Martin Luther's doctrines. In the 1520s, many city magistrates in Germany dissolved the convents. That's because they were Lutheran and they liked his teachings. And the former nuns, they were either pensioned off or married, so they had to marry them off. However, many of the nuns, they refused the magistrate's will to dissolve and resisted to leave cloister life. So many of the nuns were resistant to it. They found the convent to be a life of refuge and luxury, and they can do their own thing. And they argued with the magistrates the need to continue their convent life because it was the only way for them to have a proper and pious education. Most of the nuns, however, were not successful with the Protestant authorities, and some of them had to flee to other countries that were Catholic. Others were forced to become Lutheran, and they still argued for the need to have a cloistered convent. So even though they were Lutheran, they were still kept to their Catholic values and wanted to have a convent for the nuns. However, these pleas were largely ignored with the magistrates. And one example of a convent life was the Dominican nuns in Strasbourg who fought to keep their nunnery alive by praying in Latin. They kept praying in Latin, and they smuggled in priests for Mass, which was forbidden. And they celebrated the profession of novices, so they kept recruiting novices and getting them to profess their vows in order to keep the nunnery alive. However, in the end, it really didn't work. They were forced to shut down. Okay, the nuns in the English Reformation. Does anyone remember Henry VIII that we talked about last week?
I think he's pretty famous.
Okay, well, Henry VIII, in order to marry Anne Boleyn, he broke away from the Catholic Church and formed his own religion. Well, the nuns there, he dissolved many of the religious houses, the convents, And this is what became of the nuns in the English Reformation. So many of the nuns, they basically found themselves on their own and unemployed. The wealthier nuns in the East England, they formed small households together, so they made communities together. And other wealthier nuns, they fled to the continent and entered into Catholic convents. However, most of the nuns, because most of the nuns were poor, suffered poverty, and they had very few options of making it life outside the world, so they had very few options of making a living. They only had two choices. They either had to go back to their families or find a husband to support them. However, because they were poor, most of these nuns were forced to go into urban towns like London to make a living. So if you're a poor nun, you'd have to go into the city of London to find work. And most of them, they have to become servants in a wealthier household, so they became domestic servants. So we are going to be talking about the famous religious women of the Renaissance. And the first woman we will talk about is Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter. As everyone knows the story, supposedly she committed incest with her father and brother, and she supposedly kills people with arsenic in popular culture. But before we get started, I want to know if people will, what y'all think of this woman. Is she a pawn, or is she everything that popular culture has portrayed her to be? Okay, so Lucrezia Borgia, she was the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI and Vannozia di Cantani. Her brothers were her famous brother was Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli based the prince off of and whom he deeply admired in the prince. On June 12, 1493, Lucrezia married Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro, and she was only 13 years old when she married him. After a few years of marriage, Pope Alexander did not have any need for Giovanni Sforza. He was no longer important, and he wanted a more politically advantageous marriage for his daughter Lucrezia. And so Giovanni became a political liability, and he decided to annul her marriage because of non-consummation. So he annulled it because they did not consummate their marriage. Giovanni refused the annulment and accused Lucrezia of incest with her father. So this is where the incest rumors began to emerge, because her husband did not want the marriage to be annulled. However, Pope Alexander VI annulled the marriage anyway, and Lucrezia was free. She was single, and it happened in 1497. However, there's a big problem with this non-consummation, with this annulment, because as soon as the marriage was annulled, Lucrezia was already 6 months pregnant. So who was the father? Well, many historians and people believe that it was either a servant in Pope Alexander's household, or it was Pope Alexander VI himself. But personally, that claim of it being Pope Alexander is really discredited. It's most likely the servant in the household. So before it was annulled, she had an affair with a servant and had a secret son. She gave birth in secret, and she named the child Rodrigo. And she married Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. So the Pope wanted to have a more politically advantageous marriage to Naples. The union was blissfully happy because Alfonso was very handsome, and Lucrezia gave birth to a son. However, the marriage was short-lived, and the reason why it is short-lived is because Pope Alexander VI and her brother Cesare soon found Alfonso to be a political liability because they wanted to forge an alliance with France. And France at the time were enemies with Naples. Therefore, her husband, who was of Naples, a prince of Naples, he became a political liability. So how do you get rid of him so she could have a more political advantage marriage? Well, they already tried annulment with the first husband, but it was a headache because he created rumors and he was very resistant. So her brother decided to kill her husband and have him assassinated. So her husband was assassinated. In February 1502, Lucrezia married into the illustrious house of the D'Este family. This was a very important family because they ruled Ferrara, which at the time was a town of flourishing artists. It was very rich. They had reputation throughout Italy, and it was very advantageous for Lucrezia. And Lucrezia was happy not only because of the family's reputation, but it was also far from her father and brother. She already had enough of her family after they killed her husband. She was done with them completely and wanted to be away from them. So in 1505, she became the Duchess of Ferrara. And this is where she became a true Renaissance woman. She not only gave her husband, Alfonso, many children, but she was also a patron of the arts. And she helped make Ferrara a flourishing artist community. So she patroned many artists and paintings. And she even had an affair with the famous Pietro Bimbo, which I'll read a love letter to because have you all heard of Lord Byron? Okay, well, he called his letters to Pietro Bimbo to Lucrezia Borgia. He called them the prettiest love letters in the world. And Byron was fascinated with Lucrezia Borgia because of this, and even had a strand of her hair. He kept a lock of her hair. So this is the famous love letter that Byron called the prettiest love letters in the world. Venice, October 18th, 1503. 8 days have passed since I parted from you, and already it is as though I have been 8 years away from her. Although I cannot avow that not 1 hour has passed without her memory, which has become such a close companion to my thoughts, that now more than ever it is the food of sustenance of my soul. And if it should endure like this a few days more, as it seems it must, I truly believe, it will in every way have assumed the office of my soul. And I shall then live and thrive on the memory of her, as do other men upon their souls. And I have no life but in this single thought. Let the God who so decrees do as he will, so long as he, in exchange, as I may have as much a part of her as I shall suffice to prove the gospel of our affinity is founded on true prophecy. Often I find myself recalling, and with what ease, certain words spoken to me, Some on the balcony with the moon as witness, others at that window I shall always look upon so gladly. With all the many endearing and gracious acts I have seen my gentle lady perform, for all are dancing about my heart with a tenderness so wondrous that they inflame me with a strong desire to beg her to test the quality of my love. For I shall never rest content until I am certain she knows what she is able to enact in me, and how great and strong is the fire that her great worth has kindled in my breast. The flame of true love is a mighty force, and most of all, when two equality matched wills and two exalted minds contend to see which loves the most, each striving to give yet more vital proof. It would be the greatest delight for me to see just 2 lines of her hands. Yet I dare not ask so much. May your ladyship beseech her to perform whatever you feel is best for me. With my heart I kiss your ladyship's hand, since I cannot with my lips. So that is the famous love letter he had written to her. In 1512, she retired from public life and became deeply religious and pious, because in later paintings of her, she's almost like a nun. She's dressed as a nun. She's in black and with a veil over her head. She made many charitable acts and spent most of her nights in convents. So she basically lived like a nun through the rest of her life. She died on June 24th at the age of 39 in 1519 after having given birth to a stillborn girl, and Lord Byron kept a locket of her hair. It's really sad because she did a lot of good deeds, like she was religious and pious. She made many acts of charity, and she spent living a devoted life, yet everyone don't remember that. We only remember her as the daughter of Alexander the Sixth, who rumors say committed incest with her brother and her father, and was known to kill people with poison. So, before I move any further, now that we separated the fact from the fiction, do y'all think that she is a villainess or a pawn?
Hard to say.
To be honest, it's personal opinion, but I've read many biographies of her, and she's more of a pawn than a villain. I mean, this is a girl whose brother and father are insane, and they killed her husband, and they basically kept her under control until she became the Duchess of Ferrara. I mean, she obviously wanted to escape from her father and her brother. So she is most likely, historians believe that she's more of a pawn, a political pawn, because she's always been seen as that with her brother and her father, to be a pawn and not have a life of her own. So personally, she's more of a political pawn. Alright, next one. This is Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent, whom Henry VIII executed. And we will say why he did that. Okay, she was born around 1506. Elizabeth, she obviously came from a poor family because she was a domestic servant in Aldington, Kent. In 1529, at the age of 19, she fell ill, and that is when she started to receive mystical visions. Her life changed drastically, and she began to have visions of Jesus and Mary, and she believed that she was called on for a higher purpose. And since then, she took on a religious personality. She even predicted the death of a child in the household. I don't know if it worked. It doesn't say in the records. And encouraged people to go on pilgrimages. And she became very popular. Everyone started to believe her, that she was true, a genuine prophet. And they believed in her prophecies. Her parish priest, Richard Masters, he believed that she was genuine, and he reported her to Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he sent a commission of officials to investigate her. So they interviewed her and went through many observations to see if she was true and if her prophecies were in the teachings of the Catholic Church. The officials found her to be genuine, and her prophecies fit within the Catholic Church. So Warham, which believed, Warham and his officials believed that she was a true prophet like Joan of Arc, that this woman was true. Warham then arranged for Elizabeth to be received in St. Sepulchre's Priory in Canterbury. She became a Benedictine nun, and her reputation as a mystic continued to grow throughout England. Now remember the letter in your hand that y'all have? This is Warham, whom the letter is who writes the letter that y'all have in your hand. And if you read the letter, which we'll get to in a minute, he actually believed that she was true. Okay, so she was popular. Everyone wanted to go to her. So how did she fall from grace? Where did she go wrong? Well, it all started when Henry VIII started to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. And he began to break away from the church and form his own church. She was against Henry VIII and spoke actively against the marriage. She met with all of Catherine of Aragon's supporters, and she even went so far that she prophesied Henry VIII would die in a month if he married Anne Boleyn, which, as history goes, he did not die in a month after marrying Anne Boleyn. So that prophecy was false. The only prophecy that was true about Henry VIII was that dogs would lick his blood when he dies. Well, it's true. It's a gruesome story, but dogs did lick Henry VIII's blood when he was a corpse. And due to her popularity, Henry VIII could not touch her because she was very popular, and she went unpunished for a year. However, he had his agents spread rumors about her sexual misconduct. They said that she slept with priests. She did not. And that she was suffering from a mental illness, so they were also spreading rumors that she was crazy. Alright, but we really don't know if she was crazy. Historians believe that she may have suffered from epilepsy, but we don't know really. There's a massive debate on whether she was an imposter or genuine, and that is why she hasn't been canonized yet as a saint, because she was Catholic, because we don't know if she was true or false. However, his rumors did undermine her popularity, and this allowed for Henry to send Cromwell to arrest her and her 5 followers. In 1533, Cromwell forced her to sign a confession that she was a fraud and that she made up her own visions. So they believe that they got her confession out of torture. So she was tortured to to make this confession. Once she confessed, they were afraid to have her have a trial. So Parliament, they executed a sentence on her that she would be killed without a trial. So this woman didn't have justice. They didn't even put her up for a trial. So she was hanged and beheaded for treason at Tyburn on April 20th, 1534. She is the only woman in history to have her head put on a spike in London. So she's the only woman to have her head on a spike in London. She was buried at the Greyfriars Church in Newgate, and Anglican churches in England continue to venerate her, and they believe that she was a saint. And this is Thomas Cromwell, who orchestrated her arrest and her beheading at Tyburn. Okay, so you see this letter in hand? This is what the Archbishop Warham, right here, he wrote, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he wrote a letter to Archdeacon Hawkins about the Maid of Kent when she died. And this is what he says about her. Because he was the one that sent an investigation of officials to interrogate her and see if she's genuine and help make her a nun. Master Archdeacon, in my right hearty wise I commend me unto you. These be certain you of such news as be here now in fame among us in England. And first ye shall understand that at Canterbury within my diocese about 8 years past there was wrought a great miracle in a maid by the power of God and Our Lady, by reason of which miracle there is established a great pilgrimage. The miracle was this: the maid was taken with grievous and a continual sickness, and enduring her said sickness she had diverse and many trances, speaking of many high and godly things, telling also wondrously by the power of the Holy Ghost, as it was thought, things done and said in other places, whereas neither she was herself nor yet heard no report of. She also had trances, many strange visions and revelations, as of hell, heaven, and purgatory, and of the state of certain souls departed, and among all other visions was she should be conveyed to Our Lady of Court of Street, where souls departed, and among all other visions was that she should be conveyed where she was promised to be healed of her sickness, and that Almighty God should work wonders in her. And when she was brought thither and laid before the image of Our Lady, her face was wonderfully disfigured. So she has a disfigured face, and her tongue was hanging out, so she had her tongue out, hanging out, and her eyes being in a manner plucked and laid upon her cheeks, and so greatly disordered. Imagine seeing a woman like that, with her tongue hanging out, eyes puckered, face disfigured. Then there was heard a voice speaking within her belly, as it had been in a tongue, her lips not moving greatly, so she wasn't speaking. She, all that while continuing by the space of 3 hours and more in a trance, the which voice, when it told anything of the joys of heaven, it spake so sweetly that so heavenly that every man was ravaged with the hearing thereof, and contrary, when it was told anything of hell, it spake so horribly and terribly that it put the hearers in a great fear. So this woman was speaking many weird, strange visions, and it caused a sight. In contrary, when told anything of hell, it spake horribly and terribly, that it put hearers in great fear. It spake also many things for the confirmation of pilgrimage and trindles, hearing of masses and confessions, and many other such things. And after she had lain there a long time, she came to herself again, and was perfectly whole. And so this miracle was finished and solemnly rung, and a book written of all the whole story thereof, and put into print, which ever since that time has been commonly sold and gone abroad among all people. After this miracle done, she had a commandment from God in a vision, as she said, to profess herself as a nun. And so she was professed, and hath so continued in a nunnery at Canterbury, called Saint Sepulchre's ever since. And this whole paragraph is what historians believe why she had epilepsy. So there are many instances that she may have had epilepsy, with seizures, tongue hanging out, speaking in vision. She may have had epilepsy. Truly, I think she did marvelously stop the going forward of the king's marriage by reason of her vision. So he is praising her, saying that she did great in helping stop the king's marriage. I, hearing of these matters, sent for this holy maid to examine her. So he's saying he examined her himself. And from me she was had to Master Cromwell to be further examined there. And now she has confessed all, and uttered the very truth, which is this, that she never had a vision in all her life, but all that ever she said was feigned of her own imagination, only to satisfy the minds of them the which resorted unto her, and to obtain worldly praise. By reason of the which her confession, and many and divers, both religious men and other, be now in trouble. So her confession created trouble among the church, saying that she made this whole thing up, and the church really don't know what to do with her, and it puts the Catholic Church in trouble, because they've invested so much in Elizabeth Barton, and they don't know if she was a fraud. For as much as they consented to her mischievous and feigned visions, which contained much perilous sedition and also treason, and would not utter it, but rather further the same to their power. She said that the king should not continue to be a king after a month after he were married. So this is where she said that the king will die within a month. And within 6 months after, God would strike the realm with such a plague as was never seen, and then the king should be destroyed. That was her prophecy, that the realm would be under plague, and that the king would be destroyed, which, as you know, was not true. Alright. Katharina van Bora. This is Mrs. Martin Luther's wife. Katharina, she was from a poor noble family, and due to her family's poverty, because she came from a family of many siblings, they couldn't afford her, so she was dropped off at a Benedictine convent in Brenna. This was when she was 5 years old. Now imagine a regular 5-year-old nowadays would be going off to kindergarten. However, this woman here, she was dropped off to become a nun. At 9 years old, she moved to a Cistercian convent of Marienthron, where her aunt was a nun. This is where she professed her vows and became a nun. She was very unhappy with convent life, and was a supporter of Martin Luther's teachings, which we can see why. She was cooped up in the convent and didn't really have much contact in the outside world. And she fell in love with Martin Luther's teachings, and she didn't like her life at all. So she personally contacted Martin Luther himself. She wrote a letter asking him to help her and her fellow nuns to escape the convent. And Martin Luther agreed and arranged them to escape. And this is how they escape. It's kind of unusual. It's like a movie, really. On April 5th, 1523, in the middle of the night, Katharina and her fellow nuns fled the convent by hiding in a covered wagon filled with fish barrels. And it was a dirty and bumpy road, so they didn't have a comfortable trip. They had to feel every bump along the way. And it made a bumpy ride to Wittenberg, where they were received by Martin Luther. Martin Luther, he tried to send the nuns back to their families, but the families refused because it was a crime to harbor runaway nuns, so the families were scared to have them. And it took Martin Luther 2 years for the nuns to be married off, so he had to find the marriages or employment for the nuns. So he made sure that the nuns were well taken care of. The only nun who did not marry, who was left unmarried, was Katharina von Bora. Now, what do you do with her? All right. Katharina von Bora, she did have 2 suitors, but they never proposed to her. So Martin Luther was in a dilemma. What am I going to do with this nun? So he told her that, what kind of husband am I going to find for you? And she said, well, I don't want to marry anyone but you, Martin Luther. So she told him point blank that she only wanted to marry Martin Luther himself. So he decided. Martin Luther was reluctant at first to marry her, but he finally agreed because it would cause outrage among the Pope if he married. And also because she was from a noble family, so he would marry up. So he married her on June 13th, 1525. Martin Luther and Katharina's marriage was successful and a happy one. And historians believe that their marriage was of equality because, and it was really Katharina that really made the Protestant religion work, because when Martin Luther was off preaching, she stayed and became a wealthy and successful businesswoman. She took care of the household, and many historians didn't believe that he could have done managing a household and his teachings all at once. And this is why she was a successful businesswoman. So the Elector of Saxony, he gave Martin Luther and Katharina, upon their marriage, a 3-story former monastery as a wedding gift. Well, she turned this 3-story wedding gift into a boarding house where people of scholars could come in and they could discuss views of Martin Luther's teachings. She also had a knack for business. The monastery, she used the monastery to brew beer and land for gardening, so she made money from having her own brewery, and the land was used for gardening and cattle also. She also kept one side of the monastery as a hospital. When Martin Luther died, he left Katharina the sole inheritor in his will and made her the guardian of his 6 children. In 1552, at the age of 53, she tried to flee the plague in her area, but she died on the way because she had a major horse accident in Torgau. But this woman was very outspoken, and people believe that many of Martin Luther's views were inspired by her. for instance, on how he formed his church and his beliefs on marriage were formed because of her. Idelette de Bure. This is Mrs. John Calvin, so she's John Calvin's wife, which everyone knows. John Calvin is the founder of the Calvinist movement, the Protestant Reformation. Idelette's background is very mysterious. We really don't know much about her life. But we do know that she may have grown up in Flanders, and she married John's daughter in Liege. They had 2 children. John's daughter was an Anabaptist, and because he was an Anabaptist, he had to flee Liege to Strasbourg. Once they arrived, they met John Calvin's followers, and they loved his teaching and grew into his faith. However, John's daughter suffered an illness and died, leaving Idelette a widow. And during this time, Idelette and John Calvin, they knew each other and were acquaintances. However, John Calvin did not think of her as a choice for his wife. He wanted a virgin, a young, beautiful girl, and she was definitely not on the list because she was a widow. Okay. And she had children. So those did not make her a good candidate for John Calvin. So what made John Calvin become interested in Idelette? Well, his friend Martin Bure, he gave her a good recommendation to John Calvin. And John Calvin began to take a liking to her, a notice of her. And he really liked that she was deeply pious and had a great fervor to Calvin's teachings. So he decided she was a good choice and married her. They married on August 1st, 1540. So what did Idelette do when John Calvin was preaching? Well, John Calvin, he often had to leave her throughout the marriage, so she was mostly alone without her husband. While he was preaching, she visited the sick and made her home for refugees who fled for the Protestant faith. Idelette, she really tried to have children, at least 6 children, but they all died in infancy, one after another, and this really caused her much pain and sorrow. However, she refused to be consolated, and her only consolation was that they were with God and were in heaven, and this helped her get through after seeing one child die, because none of the children she had with John Calvin ever made it past infancy. Her marriage to John Calvin lasted 9 years. In 1549, she died of an illness. She had an illness and it lasted for 3 years, so she was sick for 3 years. She had fever. John Calvin deeply mourned her death and he never married. And I'm going to read what Idelette Calvin's last words were on her deathbed. O glorious resurrection, O God of Abraham and all our fathers, the faithful in all generations have trusted in thee, and none have ever been confounded. I too trust in thee from time to time. Pray, my friends, pray for me. John Calvin was very deeply grief-stricken that after she died, he wrote a letter to his friend mourning her, and he wrote, I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life, who, if our lot had been harsher, would have been not only the willing sharer of exile and poverty, but even of death. While she lived, she was the faithful helper of my ministry. from her, I never experienced the slightest hindrance. And her views really shaped John Calvin, even though she wasn't in his life physically very much because he was traveling. She was always in his thoughts, and even 9 years later, there's a letter in which he remembers his wife. When reading, when comparing many historians of the Reformation, they compare Katharina von Bora and Idelette. They favor Katharina von Bora more. They view her as a woman who was outspoken, and they really don't like Idelette. They view her as submissive and plain, boring, but she really helped with she really inspired John Calvin's life. Okay, so that is all for now. As I said, there are many more women theologians, but that helped make the Reformation. However, they will be, as I'm part of my writer series, because a lot of them, they wrote and published works. So I have classified them as women writers. Well, next week is going to be more exciting. It's about warrior women, so women who were in wars, and some of these women were conquerors and had advantageous triumphs. They had triumphal battles, but we will have a few women that lost in a battle and lost everything.